Hello, welcome to Post-Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll continue my conversation on various aspects of Marxist thought, and I'll be talking about the variable expenditure and fixed expenditure as discussed by Marx. Now, Marx also kind of terms it variable capital and what he considers constant capital, especially in Capital Volume 1. But for the purposes of our conversation, I'll be talking about not the constant capital, but fixed expenditure and variable expenditure, and how do they figure prominently in the everyday functioning of capitalism. So for every business or every venture, economic venture to succeed, they need to calculate and then have what is called the fixed expenditure, right? They need to know what the cost of the raw materials would be, how much the insurance would cost, electricity, water. So every business or every factory already calculates their total costs, right? And that is their fixed expenditure. That is the money they will outlay and spend every month or whatever their cycle is. And most of the times, that cost, the cost of the raw materials, storage, electricity, insurance, everything else is passed on to the customers because it's built into the price of the commodity that you're making. The variable part of the expenditure is the cost of transforming raw materials to a finished commodity. And that's the cost of labor. Okay? And this distinction is huge in understanding the question of value in Marx. Who produces value? So labor produces value because, as Marx would teach us, all the commodities that you've bought, they have a value, but you've captured that value and you pull them out of the exchange circuit, right? They now only have a value when they are transformed into a commodity through an act of labor, and when that commodity is exchanged, the commodity has an exchange value and a use value. A use value does nothing if it is not exchangeable, right? So a finished commodity can only be made through an act of labor. If you pass on the fixed expenditure to the customer, right, so there is no cost to you, then the profit is as to how much you spend in transforming the raw materials into the finished commodity. That means the profit is in labor. Labor produces that value, right? Which then means that if you can extract more labor for less money, your profit will increase. By the way, incidentally, this is also the process in which labor transforms raw materials to a commodity and adds surplus value to it. That is when money becomes capital. Okay, that's the distinction to keep in mind. Money by itself is not necessarily capital. Now, what do we do with this knowledge? I mean, I will eventually discuss this within the logic of what I've already discussed, right? The general intellect, and Franco Berardi has a wonderful discussion on it. But in traditional productive venture of capitalism, where manual labor works on raw materials to produce a commodity, you can also use this knowledge to figure out, how mathematically, how does it work? So let's take a hypothetical example. And I'm not going to take an example of industry, just the service industry. Let's say you work at a fast food chain and you get paid $10 an hour. And you come in, you clock in, and you start working, and within the first 2 minutes, you sell one Happy Meal worth $10. Now what that means is that in those 2 minutes, you produced one commodity that paid for 1 hour of your labor, right? Beyond that, the rest of the 58 minutes that you will work is pure profit, because those 58 minutes you are working for your employer, for the capitalist. He is not paying for your labor. Does that make sense? So that means, as Marx suggests, that when a worker is working, they are not always working for themselves. What he means by it is that part of their work day or work hour, they will work for themselves because that labor will pay for their work. But beyond that, traditionally, they will be working for, as soon as they paid their own wage, whatever work they give you or whatever work that can be extracted from you is pure profit. Because remember, profit is in variable capital. And variable capital is the labor of you and me, intellectual and manual labor of all of us. Now, what do we do with this knowledge? And of course, I highly recommend that you read Capital Volume 1. I usually use this knowledge to explain exploitation. Most of the times, none of us understand what literally exploitation means, right? In a way, exploitation is extraction of labor without paying you a fair wage, right? But how to roughly calculate it? And we'll not even go to Marx for it. We'll go to Adam Smith. Now, in his chapter on labor, Adam Smith clearly acknowledges that at the least, the capitalist must pay a worker enough to sustain his life, the life of his wife and 2 children, right? Now, let's imagine that we consider a 40-hour work week the ideal work week. So ideally speaking, working 40 hours a week, you, me, and every other worker should be able to sustain bare essentials of life. Okay? What are those bare essentials? Let's say food, shelter, clothing, not just for you, but for 3 other people. Plus, if you live in America, you need a car to drive to your work. You need a telephone, right? Electricity, water. Now ask yourself, if you are working a low-wage job and you work 40 hours a week, at the end of the day, what you get paid at the end of the week, does that pay for your basic necessities of life? If it does not do that, then you're exploited labor. Okay, your employer is extracting from you more than what he or she is paying for your labor. That's roughly how you calculate the exploitation of labor. So overall, fixed expenditure is that expenditure of a business that they must have, the capital that they must use to build a factory, to have the equipment, to have the insurance, electricity, and water that they pass on to the customer. Variable expenditure is the cost of labor. And it is by extracting more labor from workers for less money that a business remains and becomes profitable. If we understand this distinction, then we can understand why the industry is relocated to the south, because there were no unions first, right? Then why did they go to China? Because it has a huge captive market of workers. Why do they go to poorer parts of the world? Because there are less protections for labor and they can exploit the local corruptions and pay the workers less. Profit, if it was only made by the capitalists, then they won't go seeking cheap labor, right? What it teaches us also, and we learn it in the workerist tradition, in the compositionist Marxism, is that capital doesn't change the worker or transform the worker. It's when workers change their politics, become more aggressive in asking for their rights, that capital must re-articulate itself. So it's capital that's reactionary and not the workers. Right? So these are some of the insights if we clearly understand the role of fixed and variable expenditure in any given capitalistic venture. I hope it is useful to you. Let me know how you can use it in literary theory or in a literary class. I have successfully done that by reading how labor is represented or treated in any given novel or a story. Maybe you can do that too. Or if you have any other ideas about how to use these concepts or how to better understand these concepts, please share that with me in the comments. I'll be really grateful to you for that. That's all. Thank you so much. I hope you're staying safe and taking care of each other. I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, peace and love.